Experts propose man-made causes for the explosion. The most publicized explanation is the theory that the explosion was caused by a high-energy beam originating from the laboratory of Nikola Tesla in New York, and that he created this beam as a demonstration for Admiral Perry, who was making his final assault on the North Pole. According to this theory, Tesla overshot the mark and caused the Tunguska explosion. The National Network broadcast TV program Sightings presented this explanation as the one and only means by which this explosion could have occurred. This theory is absolutely ludicrous. There were hundreds of eyewitnesses who saw an object hurl through the sky and then explode. Even our present-day technology cannot muster the electrical energy required to create a thermonuclear blast of 40 megatons, project that amount of energy halfway around the world, and decimate 2,000 square kilometers of Earth. Even if so great an electrical discharge could be generated, sending it through the fragile ionosphere would rip away and ionize half of the planet's upper atmosphere, killing all life on the planet. The pattern of tree destruction at Tunguska clearly indicates a gigantic, high-altitude explosion, rather than an electrical discharge. Furthermore, an electrical discharge would leave no radioactive readings at the site. Therefore, a Tesla weapon electrical energy discharge theory is highly suspect and not supported by the available evidence.
At the risk of confusing you, I'd like to add this footnote. In our review of the Phenomenon Archives, we have uncovered the design and blueprint for a Nikola Tesla particle beam weapon. You remember Tesla, the great inventor who some people said was a nutcase? Because this weapon was never officially tested, there's no record of what effect it could have had. According to the New York Times, Tesla himself boasted that it could cause armies of millions to drop in their tracks. Who knows? Sounds pretty wacky. But Tesla wasn't exactly your average Joe.
Of all the proposed scientific theories, the only one that addresses all of the variables considered while taking into account the Russian government cover-up is that the Tunguska explosion was not natural in origin. On October 4th, 1959, over 51 years after the Tunguska explosion, the event earns a belated spot on the front page of the New York Times. Russian scientists report the discovery of radiation at the site and their inability to explain the explosion by any natural means. Thwarted by conflicting evidence, their collective conclusion confirms that the event was a nuclear explosion caused by an object of extraterrestrial origin.
Professor so-and-so is quoted in the newspaper so-and-so as saying in Moscow that intelligent Martians may have developed artificial oxygen eons ago and moved underground. Recently developed theories, he said, include these. A great explosion in Siberia 50 years ago, Tunguska, was caused by the crash and disintegration of a nuclear spaceship, possibly from Mars. Parentheses, an atomic explosion was sighted on Mars 2 years ago. This is 1959, okay?
As shocking as this may seem, it is now proposed that the Tunguska blast resulted from an exploding nuclear or ion-powered engine belonging to an interplanetary spacecraft. The eyewitness accounts of an object descending, then angling upwards slightly, can be explained by NASA's own study of spacecraft re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. Re-entry can only be accomplished within a 2-degree angle of descent. If the spacecraft enters at too steep an angle, it disintegrates high in the atmosphere as a result of heat caused by friction. If the angle of re-entry is too shallow, the spacecraft descends but goes back up and out of the atmosphere, much like a stone skipping across the surface of a pond. It is hypothesized that the alien craft entered the atmosphere at too shallow an angle and began skipping out of the Earth's atmosphere, When it attempted to change course, overheating caused by atmospheric friction caused the craft to explode. The explosion itself and the associated evidence is not at all consistent with a meteor or comet chemical explosion, but is consistent with a 40-megaton thermonuclear blast about 6 to 10 kilometers high in the atmosphere. The residual radiation, people dying of radiation poisoning, the abnormal accelerated growth of trees as a result of genetic mutation, geomagnetic disturbances, the want of an impact crater, the complete lack of any meteor fragments or comet debris, the collection of metallic fragments, and the Russian government's suppression of all other evidence concerning this crash site leaves only one theory intact. The event occurring in Tunguska in 1908 was the result of an explosion of a nuclear or ion-powered engine of an interplanetary spacecraft. As early as the late 1960s, NASA began test-firing nuclear engines for 21st century spacecraft. It continues to research the viability of nuclear-powered and ion-powered engines for interplanetary and interstellar travel. These engines will likely require at least as much nuclear material to cause a similar-sized detonation as that observed over Tunguska.
Well, NASA's been involved in the development of ion propulsion for over 30 years now, and very early they were able to demonstrate good engine performance. But because these engines have such low thrust levels compared to chemical rockets, very, very long burn times are required for typical planetary missions, on the order of 8,000 to 12,000 hours. So the hardest part of working with ion propulsion is demonstrating that the engine has enough lifetime for those kinds of missions.
The design and concept for such a spacecraft is not all science fiction. It is likely to be the design of our own human expedition spaceships within the next 100 years. Small-scale early versions are already being built for unmanned probes that will reach beyond the outer limits of our solar system.
The N-Star thruster will be used first on the first New Millennium mission, which is a comet and asteroid flyby. Subsequent missions in which it might be used would be small body rendezvous missions or perhaps outer planet missions.
The question remaining is why condemn this enormous and important terrestrial event to obscurity? Why hide the truth and the evidence from the people of the world? Well, the fact is that this kind of government suppression is not without precedent.
In 1947, the United States government began a massive cover-up of an alien crash site at Roswell, New Mexico. For over 50 years, it has continued this conspiracy, hiding the truth from the American people. Reports of the U.S. military concealing both a recovered interplanetary spacecraft and alien occupants have made the Roswell crash by far the world's most famous example of humanity's contact with extraterrestrial life and government cover-up. The Tunguska crash predates Roswell by nearly 4 decades. Even though no spacecraft or alien occupants are known to have been recovered, the suppression of facts and confiscation of materials collected from the site by the KGB, in addition to their program of discrediting eyewitness accounts, bears striking similarities to the U.S. cover-up of the crash site at Roswell.
There was clear evidence that there is more history to the Earth and the present situation than history now properly describes. And that became knowledgeable to both the United States and the Soviet Union in the mid-50s. And the accelerated programs to go into space. If you got to look back, you got to say, well, why all of a sudden space? Was there someone here before? Is there someone else here now? What about the planets? Are we the only planet with any form of life? Or are we the only planet that had life? The Soviets immediately, after getting into orbit, started pursuing other things, grandeur.
I think was very deeply ingrained into the Soviet leadership that there is something real out there, and that they had to have a program in place to defend the country as much from space threats as from ground threats or air threats or water threats. And so there was a military character to the space program, both from the standpoint of threat reduction and from the standpoint of threat projection. They wanted to get their military objects into space and then back into the atmosphere at the right place, and satellites could help guide that as well as manage the process, but also that there might be threats coming from extraterrestrial life. And they'd seen some of the direct impact. I mean, that particular event in 1908 was a pretty powerful event.
Tunguska scared the pants off the Russians. They were sure that little green men were going to plop down in their living rooms and start kicking their butts across the tundra. The good news is that it gave them a hot foot for getting into space, which of course inspired guess who to do the same.
So they had a tremendously aggressive program. Within the first 5 years, they launched the first satellites to go to the moon and photograph it, the first satellites to head towards Venus and head towards Mars. That's an extremely aggressive schedule. And I think it warrants us looking at why they were doing this. But you got to remember too that the Soviets are in a military society, that military is number one, and a tremendous amount of resources were being spent on the space program, which may or may not have given back military gains. So I think we need to go rethink that, what were they doing? What was their intention?
Perhaps further warming of relations between Russian and American politicians and scientists will ultimately allow for the release and analysis of the confiscated metallic fragments still hidden at the Siberian military base. With the rejection of all natural explanations for this explosion, only the release of the sole existing material evidence will assist scientists in explaining this phenomenon. Overlooked for 9 decades, the crash site at Tunguska could represent the most significant and historic, yet nearly forgotten discovery in the history of humanity.
Recounting the lessons of history from the long-neglected stories of tragedy and intrigue. These are the Phenomenon Archives, what you've never seen and what you're not supposed to know. I'm Dean Stockwell. Thanks for tuning in.